Today we're going to talk about ideas about evolution. So there's your heading, ideas about evolution. I'd go ahead and write all of this. So evolution is changes in inherited characteristics of a species over time. And a species is a group of organisms that share similar characteristics and can reproduce amongst themselves. So go ahead and write both of those. So if you evolve as a person, you change for the best. And if you're changing for the best, that means you're probably making life a little easier. Maybe you're a little nicer, maybe you understand things better, maybe you're a better student, but it's going to help you survive. Well, animals and plants evolving their characteristics is the same thing. They're changing for the better in order for them to survive. A species, group of organisms that share similar characteristics and reproduce. We as humans are the same species. We all have similar characteristics and we can all reproduce amongst ourselves. Okay, your dog and your cat cannot mate and have cat-dog puppies. Okay, can't happen because they're different species. It wouldn't work. If I'm going too fast, you can always pause. All right, now nothing to write here, but just to kind of listen. The whole theory of evolution, a big chunk of that comes from Charles Darwin. Okay, so Charles Darwin, I believe it was sometime in the 1600s. Charles Darwin was a young man who was interested in outdoors, plants and animals, and he didn't really know what he was going to do with his life. And so he hopped on this ship that was taking goods around the world. Okay, and he was a British dude. So they basically went all around the world here. Okay, on this big long trip. And these trips don't take like a day or a weekend or a week. This is like many months, over a year type of thing. Okay? So he took this trip, and basically what they did was they needed healthy, strong young men to load the ship and drop off goods in certain places and load the ship and unload the ship. Okay, so you signed up for that, got paid for it, got to see the world a little bit. And anytime they stopped, they would stop for a few days or a week, and he'd kind of get to wander around and see some places. Well, they got off the western coast of South America, and he was kind of a nerdy dude here. They got to over here, okay? And he started noticing some things. He would also like carry a notebook and draw pictures of plants and animals, and maybe keep some leaves and some dead animals, and bring them back with him to study. And there's this island, this chain of islands off of South America called the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos are caused by volcanoes. Basically, there's a hot spot there. That volcano will erupt a long time over time and then make an island. And then make another island and another island over millions of years. Okay? And what he noticed was the birds, these finches. I don't know if you know what finches are. They're small little birds. Around here, they're brightly colored. They can be like bright yellow and red and stuff like that. I know my grandpa used to feed them. But he noticed that the finches in South America and the finches in the Galapagos Islands were very, very similar. But they were slightly different. Their beaks looked different. And what he noticed is that everything looked the same except the beaks in South America, on the finches in South America, were long and slender, meant to basically get nectar out of flowers. And also, some of them ate grubs and worms, but it was long and skinny. He noticed that the finches on the islands, which were very, very similar, but they had short, stocky beaks like this that they used to break open seeds and nuts. And this got him thinking that maybe these finches on the islands originally came from South America. And he came up with this hypothesis. You don't need to write anything. But Darwin hypothesized that the plants and animals on the islands originally came from South America. So these little islands, all the living things on it, had originally come from the big island of South America. He thought that the members of the population that were best able to survive and reproduce would pass their traits on to the next generation over time. Distances or differences can result in new species. Okay? So, what he thought happened, or his hypothesis, is that somehow the birds got from South America to the island. And the ones that had the beaks that were smaller and thicker, shorter and thicker, were able to open up the seeds, eat them, survive, and reproduce. The ones that had the long, skinny beaks would not survive and reproduce, and they would die off. And over time, the beaks became shorter and thicker because that was the trait that was needed in order to survive on the islands. Darwin's hypothesis, I want you to write down the red part here. Natural selection. Organisms with traits suited to their environment will more likely survive and reproduce. Organisms with traits suited to their environment will more likely survive and reproduce. I'm going to give you a little hypothetical situation. Let's say this entire class, we get hypothetical situation means just go with it. Don't poke any holes in the story, just go with it. Let's say this entire class, we get sealed in my science classroom, and we are all wild animals, we cannot get out. Okay? Now, the food source that you need, okay, is way up high, way on the way high shelf. Now, we are wild animals. We don't help each other out, okay? Let's pretend we don't have any desks to climb on or anything like that. But it's way up high near the ceiling. Which people are going to have the traits needed to survive? Now, you're probably going to say the really tall people, okay? So the tall people would survive, be able to get food, survive, and reproduce. And tall people tend to have babies who are tall. So the tall people are going to survive and pass on their DNA. If you're a short person who cannot reach the food, you're going to die off and your genes will not get passed on. Okay? So that would be another example of natural selection. If you're suited for an environment, you will survive. If you're not, you will die. Another example with the Galapagos was each island has the Galapagos tortoise, and it's a really big tortoise, and some of them have long necks and some of them have short necks. Okay? Well, the long-necked tortoises have to reach up way up high, and they eat cactuses. They have to reach really high to eat the part of the cactus that they want. So they have to have a long neck. If they had a short neck, they wouldn't be able to reach there and they would die off. The long-necked ones will survive, have babies who also have long necks, and they'll pass those on. Okay, so natural selection. I want you to write this down. Variation, an inherited trait that makes an individual different from other members of the same species. An inherited trait that makes an individual different from other members of the same species. We all have variations, okay? We all have different eye colors. That's a variation. Hair color, skin tone. Some of us are tall, some are short. None of these things are helping us survive. None of these things are keeping us from surviving, but they're slight differences. So a variation is something different in us, but it's not helpful or harmful. It's just kind of there. Me having brown hair is not helping me survive, but it's different than some of you. I want you to write down adaptation and the first red bullet there. So adaptation, a variation that makes an organism better suited to its environment. A variation that makes an organism better suited to its environment is an adaptation. So if all of a sudden being tall helps me survive, like in that hypothetical situation where I had to reach up and get the food, then that would become an adaptation. It would be helpful. I would pass that on to my kids, and it would help them survive as well. An example, someone in here, whether they say it or not, probably has webbed toes. Okay, where you have like skin in between your toes, kind of like a duck. Now that is a variation right now. It's a difference. Okay, it's different compared to what most people have, but it is not going to help you survive right now. Now, if something happens, let's say we have the earth warms, all of the ice melts, and it floods everywhere. And all of a sudden, the world is flooded. And now it's beneficial to be a good swimmer. And if you're not, you will die off. Well, now all of a sudden, that variation of the webbed toes becomes an adaptation. It becomes a benefit. It's going to help you survive. So now you have webbed toes. All the people without webbed toes would drown, and all the people with it would be just fine. They'd have babies, and their babies would have webbed toes, and that would be an adaptation. Okay? There are some environmental factors that changes genes. One is geographic isolation, when two populations get separated. That's exactly what happened in the Galapagos Island situation, where they were put on an island. They kind of changed over a long period of time. Another example, Madagascar has some crazy examples of wildlife because Madagascar is its own island, pretty large island off of Africa, and it's got some weird animals because they got separated and from the mainland and evolved a certain way. Australia, the same thing. There's some weird animals in Australia because of the geographic isolation. I do want you to write down gradualism, and I want you to write down slow evolution, and punctuated equilibrium, fast evolution. Gradualism is slow evolution. Punctuated equilibrium is fast evolution. If I do something gradually, if I dig a hole gradually, I might dig a few shovelfuls out and then leave it alone for a while. And then I might come back later and dig a little bit more. And then maybe tomorrow I'll come back and do it a little bit. And then maybe a little bit the next day. Okay, if I gradually do something, I slowly do things. Most evolution is gradual, where it just slowly happens. So those finch beaks slowly got shorter and thicker and stronger over many generations. It wasn't just all of a sudden they had a a kid with a small beak. It was over a long period of time they gradually got slower and slower. Punctuated equilibrium usually happens because of a mutation. And all of a sudden just there's this mutant gene that is beneficial. In the times of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, in England, the Industrial Revolution is when everything changed to machines. So instead of making things by hand, we used machines. And during that time, I believe it was the 1800s, there was a lot of pollution, a lot of smoke, and things being, it was dirty. But we could make things very quickly, okay? Well, there's this type of white butterfly in England that would sit on the white rocks that were naturally in the landscape. And when they'd sit on those white rocks, they would hide. And nothing could see them. Birds couldn't eat them. But there was this mutant gray form of this butterfly that once in a while they'd have a gray one. And that gray one would sit on the white rock, and it would get easily spotted by birds, and the birds would swoop down and eat it. And there were usually not very many gray ones because they got eaten easily. Okay, well, with the Industrial Revolution and pollutant, some of those rocks eventually got covered in like ash and smoke, and they went from being white to being gray. So then what happened was those white butterflies would sit on the gray rocks that were dirty from the factory, and they would get eaten because they were easily spotted. But every once in a while there was a mutated gray one that would sit there, and it would be just fine. It would blend in. And after just a few years, pretty soon, gray butterflies were everywhere, and there were very few white ones. Okay, and that just happened over a few years. That would be punctuated equilibrium or fast evolution. That is it for today.